Hi everyone, it's me, Anna Newborg, your Wilkinsburg Library Director. I thought that our children's librarian Rachel has been doing such a great job with the children's story times that our adults might be feeling a little bit left out. So today we're going to try an adult story time. The story I'll be reading is a short story featuring one of my favorite detectives. He's a curious little man with glorious mustaches and an egg-shaped head, and his name is Hercule Poirot. The short story that we will be reading today is The Tragedy at Marsdon Manor, featuring Hercule Poirot, and the story was written by the great mystery writer Agatha Christie. So let's begin. I had been called away from town for a few days, and on my return found Poirot in the act of strapping up his small valise. "Ah, la bonne heure, Hastings, I feared you would not have returned in time to accompany me. You are called away on a case, then?" "Yes, though I am bound to admit that, on the face of it, the affair does not seem promising. The Northern Union Insurance Company have asked me to investigate the death of a Mr. Maltravers, who a few weeks ago insured his life with them for the large sum of £50,000. "Yes?" I said, much interested. "There was, of course, the usual suicide clause in the policy. In the event of his committing suicide within a year, the premiums would be forfeited. Mr. Maltravers was duly examined by the company's own doctor, and although he was a man slightly past the prime of life, was passed as being in quite sound health. However, on Wednesday last, the day before yesterday, the body of Mr. Maltravers was found in the grounds of his house in Essex, Marsdon Manor, and the cause of his death is described as some kind of internal hemorrhage. That in itself would be nothing remarkable, but sinister rumors as to Mr. Maltravers' financial position have been in the air of late, and the Northern Union have ascertained beyond any possible doubt that the deceased gentleman stood upon the verge of bankruptcy. Now that alters matters considerably. Maltravers had a beautiful young wife, and it is suggested that he got together all the ready money he could for the purpose of paying the premiums on a life insurance for his wife's benefit, and then committed suicide. Such a thing is not uncommon. In any case, my friend Alfred Wright, who is a director of the Northern Union, has asked me to investigate the facts of the case. But, as I told him, I am not very hopeful of success. If the cause of death had been heart failure, I should have been more sanguine. Heart failure may always be translated as the inability of the local GP to discover what his patient really did die of. But a hemorrhage seems fairly definite. Still, we can but make some necessary inquiries. 5 minutes to pack your bag, Hastings, and we will take a taxi to Liverpool Street." About an hour later, we alighted from a Great Eastern train at the little station of Marsdon Lee. Inquiries at the station yielded the information that Marsdon Manor was about a mile distant. Poirot decided to walk, and we betook ourselves along the main street. "What is our plan of campaign?" I asked. "First, I will call upon the doctor. I have ascertained that there is only one doctor in Marsdon Lee, Dr. Ralph Bernard. Ah, here we are at his house." The house in question was a kind of superior cottage, standing back a little from the road. A brass plate on the gate bore the doctor's name. We passed up the path and rang the bell. We proved to be fortunate in our call. It was the doctor's consulting hour, and for the moment there were no patients waiting for him. Dr. Bernard was an elderly man, high-shouldered and stooping with a pleasant vagueness of manner. Poirot introduced himself and explained the purpose of our visit, adding that the insurance companies were bound to investigate fully in a case of this kind. Of course," said Dr. Bernard vaguely. "I suppose as he was a rich man, his life was insured for a big sum. You consider him a rich man, Doctor?" The doctor looked rather surprised. Was he not? He kept 2 cars, you know, and Marsdon Manor is a pretty big place to keep up, although I believe he bought it very cheap. "I understand that he had considerable losses of late," said Poirot, watching the doctor narrowly. The latter, however, merely shook his head sadly. "Is that so? Indeed. It is fortunate for his wife, then, that there is this life insurance. A very beautiful and charming young creature, but terribly unstrung by this sad catastrophe. A mass of nerves, poor thing. I have tried to spare her all I can, but of course the shock was bound to be considerable." "You have been attending Mr. Maltravers recently?" "My dear sir, I never attended him." "What?" I understand Mr. Maltravers was a Christian Scientist or something of that kind. But you examined the body? Certainly. I was fetched by one of the undergardeners. And the cause of death was clear? Absolutely. There was blood on the lips, but most of the bleeding must have been internal. Was he still lying where he had been found? Yes. The body had not been touched. He was lying on the edge of a small plantation. He had evidently been out shooting rooks. A small rook rifle lay beside him. The hemorrhage must have occurred quite suddenly. Gastric ulcer, without a doubt. No question of his having been shot, eh? My dear sir! I demand pardon, said Poirot humbly. But if my memory is not at fault in the case of a recent murder, the doctor first gave a verdict of heart failure, altering it when the local constable pointed out that there was a bullet wound through the head. You will not find any bullet wounds on the body of Mr. Maltravers, said Dr. Bernard dryly. Now, gentlemen, if there is nothing further, we took the hint. Good morning, and many thanks to you, Doctor, for so kindly answering our questions. By the way, you saw no need for an autopsy? Certainly not. The doctor became quite apoplectic. The cause of death was clear, and in my profession we see no need to distress unduly the relatives of a dead patient. And then turning, the doctor slammed the door sharply in our faces. And what do you think of Dr. Bernard Hastings? Inquired Poirot as we proceeded on our way to the manor. Rather an old ass. Exactly. Your judgments of characters are always profound, my friend. I glanced at him uneasily, but he seemed perfectly serious. A twinkle, however, came into his eye, and he added slyly, That is to say, when there is no question of a beautiful woman. I looked at him coldly. On our arrival to the manor house, the door was opened to us by a middle-aged parlour-maid. Poirot handed her his card and a letter from the insurance company for Mrs. Maltravers. She showed us into a small morning room and retired to tell her mistress. About 10 minutes elapsed, and then the door opened. A slender figure in widow's weeds stooped upon the threshold. Monsieur Poirot, she faltered. Madame! Poirot sprang gallantly to his feet and hastened towards her. I cannot tell you how I regret to derange you in this way, but what will you? Laissez-faire, they know no mercy. Mrs. Maltravers permitted him to lead her to a chair. Her eyes were red with weeping, but the temporary disfigurement could not conceal her extraordinary beauty. She was about 27 or 8 and very fair, with large blue eyes and a pretty pouting mouth. It is something about my husband's insurance, is it? But must I be bothered now, so soon? Courage, my dear madam, courage. You see, your late husband insured his life for rather a large sum. And in such a case, the company always has to satisfy itself as to a few details. They have empowered me to act for them. You can rest assured that I will do all in my power to render the matter not too unpleasant for you. Will you recount to me briefly the sad events of Wednesday? I was changing for tea when my maid came up. One of the gardeners had just run to the house. He had found... Her voice trailed away. Poirot pressed her hand sympathetically. I comprehend. Enough. You have seen your husband earlier in the afternoon? Not since lunch. I had walked down to the village for some stamps, and I believe he was out pottering around the grounds. Shooting rooks, eh? Yes, he usually took his little rook rifle with him, and I heard 1 or 2 shots in the distance. Where is this little rook rifle now? In the hall, I think. She led the way out of the room and found and handed the little weapon to Poirot, who examined it cursorily. 2 shots fired, I see, he observed as he handed it back. And now, madame, if I might see... He paused delicately. The servant shall take you, she murmured, averting her head. The parlour-maid summoned led Poirot upstairs. I remained with the lovely and unfortunate woman. It was hard whether to know to speak or to remain silent. I essayed 1 or 2 general reflections to which she responded absently, and in a very few minutes Poirot rejoined us. I thank you for all your courtesy, madam. I do not think you need be troubled any further with this matter. By the way, do you know anything of your husband's financial position? She shook her head. Nothing whatever. I am very stupid over business things. I see. Then you can give us no clue as to why he suddenly decided to insure his life? He had not done so previously, I understand. Well, we had only been married a little over a year. But as to why he insured his life, it was because he had absolutely made up his mind that he would not live long. He had a strong premonition of his own death. I gathered that he had had one hemorrhage already, and that he knew that another one would prove fatal. I tried to dispel these gloomy fears of his, but without avail. Alas, he was only too right. Tears in her eyes, she bade us a dignified farewell. Poirot made a characteristic gesture as we walked down the drive together. Ah, bien, that is that. Back to London, my friend. There appears to be no mouse in this mouse-hole. And yet what? A slight discrepancy, that is all. You noticed it? You did not? Still, life is full of discrepancies. And assuredly the man cannot have taken his own life. There is no poison that would fill his mouth with blood. No, I must resign myself to the fact that all is clear and above board. But who is this? A tall young man was striding up the drive towards us. He passed us without making any sign, but I noted that he was not ill-looking, with a lean, deeply bronzed face that spoke of life in a tropic clime. A gardener who was sweeping up leaves had paused for a minute in his task, and Poirot ran quickly up to him. Tell me, I pray you, who is that gentleman? Do you know him? I don't remember his name, sir, though I did hear it. He was staying down here last week for a night. Tuesday it was. Quick, mon ami, let us follow him. We hastened up the drive after the retreating figure. A glimpse of a black-robed figure on the terrace at the side of the house, and our quarry swerved and we after him, so that we were witnesses of the meeting. Mrs. Maltravers almost staggered where she stood, and her face blanched noticeably. You, she gasped. I thought you were on the sea, on your way to East Africa. I got some news from my lawyers that detained me, explained the young man. My old uncle in Scotland died unexpectedly and left me some money. Under the circumstances, I thought it better to cancel my passage. Then I saw this bad news in the paper, and I came down to see if there was anything I could do. You want someone to look after things for you for a bit, perhaps. At that moment, they became aware of our presence. Poirot stepped forward and with many apologies explained that he had left his stick in the hall. Rather reluctantly, it seemed to me, Mrs. Maltravers made the necessary introduction. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Black. A few minutes' chat ensued, in the course of which Poirot elicited the fact that Captain Black was putting up at the Anchor Inn. The missing stick not having been discovered, which was not surprising. Poirot uttered more apologies, and we withdrew. We returned to the village at a great pace, and Poirot made a beeline for the Anchor Inn. Here we establish ourselves until our friend the captain returns, he explained. You notice that I emphasized the point that we were returning to London by first train? Possibly you thought I meant it. But no, you observed Mrs. Maltravers' face when she caught sight of this young black. She was clearly taken aback, and he, eh bien, he was very devoted, did you not think so? And he was here on Tuesday night, the day before Mr. Maltravers died. We must investigate the doings of Captain Black, Hastings. In about half an hour we espied our quarry approaching the inn. Poirot went out and accosted him and presently brought him up to the room we had engaged. I have been telling Captain Black of the mission which brings us here, explained. You can understand, Monsieur le Capitaine, that I am anxious to arrive at Mr. Maltravers' state of mind immediately before his death, and that at the same time I do not wish to distress Mrs. Maltravers unduly by asking her painful questions. And that is where we will stop for today. We'll finish the other half next week. In the meantime, let's think of how Mr. Maltravers might have died. Was it an accident? A hemorrhage? Did his wife have something to do with it? What about this mysterious Captain Black? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.